Coming up, learning to live with COVID-19. You're not going to like what that really means. Plus, some good news about a Good Samaritan.
You're listening to Brent's 2 Cents, the semi-serious thoughts of a guy in Belize. And now here's the host of this podcast from somewhere in Belize City, Brent Toombs.
Look, if you don't care for me, I understand. I totally do. I'm the guy who has told you that you cannot shop. I am the person who has come before you and said, you can't go to church. You can't see your friends. If you don't think that COVID's real, right now you're an idiot. You need to understand that we're all in this together. You cannot fail to understand this. So I'm the guy who has to tell you to stay apart at Christmas and in the holiday season you celebrate, with your faith or without your faith. I'm that guy. And I'll say that because it will keep you safe. I'm the guy who's stealing Christmas to keep you safe. Because you need to do this now. You need to do the right thing.
That's Brian Pallister, the Premier of the Canadian province of Manitoba. Now you can hear his voice breaking as he laid out for his people the harsh reality that, for the sake of their own health, Christmas as people know it is cancelled this year. You see, COVID-19 has gotten out of control in Manitoba. In fact, it's out of control in much of Canada right now. And this is despite the fact that Canadians did a very good job of containing the spread of the virus in the early months of this pandemic. Gee, does that sound familiar? So why am I starting this episode with an audio clip from a Canadian politician? Well, the situation in Belize is very similar. In fact, the current COVID-19 crisis ravaging our country is worse than what's happening in Canada right now. But our response is much, much different. Hey, welcome to the podcast for the week of December the 7th. Now, when I started this podcast back in July, I never imagined I would spend so much time talking about COVID-19. Because back then, the situation in Belize was actually pretty good, at least compared to much of the world. So I imagined this podcast would have a lot more humor to it, maybe some funny anecdotes about life in Belize, and, of course, lots of politics. But over the past 5 months that I've been doing this podcast, the situation with COVID-19 in Belize has changed badly. On Thursday of last week, when the evening update from the Ministry of Health and Wellness came out saying that 241 new infections and 4 deaths had been recorded in Belize, well, to be totally honest with you, it sent me into a bit of a depression. And it wasn't the first time that I felt this way because of the virus. It's something I find myself having to deal with more and more frequently. Now, I know many people are suffering from COVID-19 fatigue because they are tired of restrictions, and certainly a lot of people are suffering both physically and psychologically from the economic impact of the pandemic. But for me, it's this sense of hopelessness about our national response that I just can't shake. I'm tired of talking about improper mask use or illegal gatherings or businesses skirting regulations, but I can't not talk about it either. So that's what I'm going to talk about on this podcast. How we need to learn to live with COVID-19, but how that does not mean what you think it means. At the time of recording this episode, Belize had 3,747 cases of COVID-19 and had recorded 173 deaths. That's an increase of 1,562 cases and 57 deaths in just 2 weeks. The New York Times published a story over the weekend on the countries that have been hit the hardest over the last 14 days. And Belize was number 8 on that list in terms of positive cases and 13 for the most deaths. These are numbers based on per 100,000 people, so it's an apples to apples comparison. Now, despite what a shit show the USA is at the moment, statistically, they have done a much better job than Belize over the past 14 days. So has Mexico and Guatemala. On November 28th, the government of Belize issued a new SI with increased COVID-19 containment measures. But really, all they did was ban indoor dining at restaurants and implement a curfew from 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. for the next 21 days. There were two other significant regulations in that SI that have been completely downplayed or just outright ignored. First was a directive that all organizations, public or private, must make their employees work from home if it's possible for them to do their job remotely. And that's a big shift from the previous SI that only said employees should be allowed to work from home if they wish. But unless the Ministry of Health starts conducting snap inspections of workplaces and questioning why employees are still in office performing tasks that could otherwise be done remotely, very few businesses are going to comply. The second regulation that is being ignored is that businesses, including retail stores, are only allowed to have as many people inside their establishment as can be safely, physically distanced. However, that number must not exceed 20 people. That means no matter how big your store is, there should be no more than 20 customers inside at the same time. Well, I can tell you from personal experience that regulation is not being enforced, not at the grocery stores or retailers that I visited this weekend. Certain businesses were packed, and I think you know which stores I'm talking about. Oh, but come on, Brent. It's Christmas. And hey, in Belize, Christmas is even more untouchable than a minister's son. But as I said previously on this podcast, I don't expect the government to get serious about implementing restrictions that would help contain the spread of the virus until January, at the earliest. Late last week, it was announced that government is working on a plan to reopen the commercial free zone at the northern border as soon as possible. Obviously, just in time for Christmas. And if you think Marab gets crowded at this time of year, just wait until the free zone opens. The infection rate in Corozal will likely skyrocket as people working in the free zone get infected and bring the virus home from the border. But hey, at least there'll be some good deals on contraband liquor on Facebook buy and sell. It is clear that the government does not have the will to tell the people that Christmas can't be the same this year. And it's clear that most people would rather risk catching a virus that could kill them or their loved ones than alter how they live their lives or operate their businesses, especially at this time of year. How many times have you heard people say, "The virus is not going anywhere. We just have to learn to live with it"? That's what they tell you as they refuse to yield to the realities of COVID-19. And yes, we do have to learn to live with COVID-19. I completely agree with that statement. However, learning to live with COVID-19 does not mean to just ignore it or to leave it up to God or hope for the best while we go about socializing and shopping and doing whatever we want. Learning to live with COVID-19 means that we need to relearn how to function in a world where a deadly virus is all around us. It means that we have to accept that periodic shutdowns or curfews and closures of high-risk establishments will be part of the new normal. Learning to live with COVID-19 means that you might have to wait outside for your turn to enter a business, or that employees of that business will need to work from home. Learning to live with COVID-19 means that the next time restaurants are allowed to open for dine-in, they actually have to operate like restaurants, not as de facto bars or nightclubs, So no more 2-for-1 Jaeger bombs with your barbecue or bottle service with your pizza and chicken fingers. Learning to live with COVID-19 means accepting that you won't be able to celebrate weddings or birthdays or national holidays the way you want. It means that until the virus is actually contained and we see a significant decrease in new infections, that you shouldn't have anyone visit your home if they don't actually live there. Yes, even at Christmas. These things are harsh, and they suck. But you know what sucks a lot more? Catching a disease that you could have avoided and giving it to someone else who ends up dying. Because right now, we are not learning to live with COVID-19. We are dying from it at a rate faster than all but 13 other countries on Earth at this moment. Because we don't want to accept that living with COVID-19 means changing much about the way we live.
We want to hear from you. You can find Brent's 2 Cents on Twitter and Facebook at 2 Cents Belize, or email us at podcast@oshaproductions.com. That's OXAProductions.com.
Okay, how about a little good news? Because yes, despite the COVID situation in Belize, there is still good news worth talking about. Now, Andrew Munnings is a mortician, or an undertaker. Do we still use the word undertaker? Anyway, on Friday night, Andrew was driving back to Belize City from a funeral in Belmopan when his car developed trouble at mile 39 on the George Price Highway. Smoke started coming out from one of the wheels, so he pulled over. And soon after, a Good Samaritan traveling in the same direction stopped to offer Andrew assistance. Now, remember, it's night on a remote section of highway, and due to the crime situation in Belize, I don't think many of us would have stopped to assist a complete stranger, especially a male, under those circumstances. But this Samaritan who was traveling with his family did stop, and he spent the next 2 hours helping Andrew get his car roadworthy, or at least worthy enough that he could limp the 39 miles back to Belize City. And the Samaritan didn't just leave Andrew behind after helping him fix his vehicle. No, he followed Andrew all the way back to Belize City just to make sure he got home safe. Now, the Good Samaritan is a taxi driver from Belize City by the name of Arsenio Romero. And when Andrew offered to pay Arsenio for his time and trouble, Arsenio refused to accept any money. And that part of the story doesn't surprise me because I actually know Arsenio. In fact, he's a very good friend of mine. I first met Arsenio and his family about 3.5 years ago when I was working on a story about migration from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, or what's known as the Northern Triangle. Arsenio and his family had arrived in Belize about a year before I met them, as asylum seekers who had fled El Salvador with nothing more than the clothes on their backs and whatever they could carry in their hands. They were processed by the UNHCR and had been vetted and approved by the Belize Refugee Committee to remain in Belize. But then their file, along with the files of nearly 1,000 other asylum seekers, stalled on the desk of then Minister of State responsible for immigration, Beverly Williams. In her office, I asked Minister Williams why she was unwilling to sign any of the applications that had been approved by the committee. Her response to me was, because if I sign them, then what happens next? It would be nearly another year before Williams finally did sign off on Arsenio's status. Arsenio, his wife Mary, and their adult children are great people, hardworking and honest as the day is long. They have busted their ass to make a new life for themselves in our country, and I'm in awe of their resiliency. Belize is blessed to have people like Arsenio Romero call this jewel home, and I feel blessed to have Arsenio as a friend. And that's some good news. Okay, before I go, I want to send a shout out to Kim and Lam at Change the Narrative Podcast. This is a Belizean podcast that I highly recommend. And Kim and Lam put out a great episode just last week about priorities when it comes to politics, the economy, and COVID-19. You can find Change the Narrative on all the podcast platforms, and I'll put a direct link in the show notes for this episode. Remember, you can be part of the podcast movement in Belize by sharing this show with at least one person who otherwise may not know about it. And don't forget to subscribe to Brent's 2 Cents on your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. You can contact me anytime on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at 2 Cents Belize. And I occasionally post stuff on TikTok, so why not give me a follow there as well? Don't forget, you can also leave me a voice message to play on the next episode by clicking on the link you'll find in the show notes. I'd love to hear what you thought about this episode or any episode. Do you agree or disagree with what I've said? Drop me a voice message and share your 2 cents. And that's going to do it for episode 19 of Brent's 2 Cents. Until next time, please continue to wear your masks, wash your hands, stay home as much as possible, and most importantly, be nice to each other.
Brent's 2 Cents is a presentation of OSHA Productions, Belize's affordable professional video production company.